Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast. Whether you are a regular listener or a new listener, we appreciate you and hope that you enjoy what is sure to be a fascinating episode today. But before we roll into this, I want to give Mehul tons of props. He's been battling just about everything flu-wise lately, and he's really stepped up today.
Yeah, well, Dion, the show must go on, and I apologize if you hear my throat lozenge in my mouth, but it's the only thing keeping me from coughing and gagging. And if I do that, apologies. But you know what, Dion, let's roll on because we've got a great guest today. It's Dr. Ragy Girgis, and he's going to talk about mental illness and mass shootings. Now, Dr. Girgis is the curator of the Columbia Mass Murder Database. He's also a professor of clinical psychiatry at the Columbia University Department of Psychiatry and New York State Psychiatric Institute.
Based on data from 2,200 mass murders going back to 1900, Dr. Girgis has some fascinating and surprising conclusions about mental illness and mass shootings. Dr. Girgis is an author, researcher, and has appeared on podcasts and television to discuss his fascinating work.
And, we felt it was especially timely to have Dr. Girgis on now in light of the recent assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. No doubt the reasons that somebody would commit a mass shooting are multifactorial, but we're excited to have an expert today, Dr. Girgis, to help us learn about what some of those factors are.
Absolutely, Mehul. Let's see what we can learn from the doctor on what is unfortunately a very timely topic. Dr. Girgis, welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast. We're really excited to have you on today and learn from your great research.
I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
So let's dig in. Tell us a little bit about what drove you into the field of psychiatry and how you ended up at Columbia.
Thank you. Well, I went to medical school at the University of Pittsburgh. In my third year, which was our major clinical year, I spent time on the schizophrenia inpatient unit at Pittsburgh. And I knew then that that's what I had to do. Fast forward to my residency and fellowship, I focused on schizophrenia. I became a researcher, so I'm a full-time clinical researcher. And then I made my way into the mass murder kind of field and into mass murder research because I wanted to determine as definitively and as evidence-based as possible whether there really is an association between psychosis in particular, but mental health in general, and mass shootings. And of course there isn't, but I wanted to answer that question for myself.
Was there an event at the time that drove you into that, or was it just your general curiosity?
General curiosity. As you all know, of course, mass shootings have been on the rise for several decades now. And so it seems like there's always a mass shooting in the media. And so it's just something that was, that's, almost, on a weekly basis kind of.
Unfortunately, that's
relevant.
True.
Well, Dr. Girgis, tell us about your exciting project here, the Columbia Mass Murder Database, why you started it, how you got it together, and, what kind and volume of data that it contains.
Exactly. Thank you. Well, about 4 years ago, like I mentioned, my colleague, Dr. Gary Bricado, and I really wanted to, as definitively and in an evidence-based manner as possible, answer the question of how or whether psychosis and mental health generally is related to mass shootings. And so we put together this database. We wanted it to be as comprehensive as possible. There are several databases out there. We wanted to incorporate mass shootings from 1900 on, as opposed to just more recently, to examine changes over time. We wanted to examine mass shootings outside of America, to examine differences between mass shootings and mass murder in general in America versus outside of America. And most uniquely, I think, we wanted to really understand why mass shooters in particular use firearms rather than other weapons. And as any scientist or any person who kind of understands research knows, the way that we understand a variable or how something happens is we compare two or more groups and we limit the number of differences between the groups so that we can focus on the one difference that between the two groups, and that then helps us better understand that difference. So we want to understand why firearms are used, and so we thought the best group with which to compare mass shooters to answer that question would be mass murderers who don't use firearms but use other methods. And so we collected all of the same information for people who are mass murderers who did not use firearms. So we're talking about knives and blunt objects and poison and motor vehicles and all those sorts of things. And so our database has all publicly available mass murders, including those perpetrated with firearms and other methods, conducted around the world since 1900. We were, of course, limited to English language databases and media from which we gained our information. But so we have a database of about 2,200 mass murders. We defined mass murder as any mass killing that involved 3 or more fatalities, not including the victim. And we focused on personal cause mass murders. So this means mass murder that was not state-sponsored, did not occur as part of war, was not gang-related, those sorts of things.
Quick question. In the group where a firearm was not used, I'm just curious, what was the most curious means that you encountered?
Yeah, I was
for death.
Which number 2 is basically what we're trying to find out.
There are a lot of differences. There are obviously some similarities, but a lot of differences between the two groups. To name a few, which is, I think, very relevant to especially the mass shooter group. But so by and large, most mass murderers of any type are not psychopaths, but psychopaths, people with psychopathy, which is a technical term, are much less likely to use firearms. So you'll see more psychopaths in the mass murder group who uses methods other than firearms than the mass shooter group. And just to step back and give context, so about among serial killers, about 87 to 90% of people are psychopaths. Among all murderers, about 25% are, among single or double murders, about 25% are psychopaths. Among mass shooters, 1% are psychopaths. Among mass murderers who don't use firearms, the number is more like 2 or 3%. That's a significant difference, statistically speaking, but that's how that lines up. And a few other differences, as you all know, as people know intuitively, women do not use firearms. They almost never use firearms. When women commit mass murder, they use other weapons. So among that group of mass murderers who don't use firearms, you'll see many more women. That group is still dominated by men, but you'll see many more women. Related to that, and the biggest difference, or the difference most relevant to my work, is that, as you know, as a lot of people have thought about, and of course there's a lot about this in the media, mental illness is very uncommonly seen as a driver of mass shootings. People with psychotic disorders are slightly overrepresented among mass shooters. So if about 1 to 2% of the population has a psychotic disorder, about 4% of mass shooters have a psychotic disorder that actually contributed to the mass shooting. So they are overrepresented, but they obviously and certainly don't represent the majority, even close to the majority of mass shooters. However, if we're talking about mass murderers who use other methods, like methods besides firearms, then psychosis plays a much greater role, especially if we're talking about women. So if we're talking about a woman mass murderer, then chances are they're psychotic.
Okay, great. Really, really interesting. We might have jumped ahead a little bit, but I have an even less academic question, really. And I was just that in this database of the people who didn't commit murder with guns, what was the most creative means that they used? Like you mentioned poisoning. I'm just curious, was there anything that stood out as like, wow, I would never think to even use that to kill somebody? Sure.
Well, vehicular mass murder is relatively common. Some people were able to use airplanes in a personal cause, non-state sponsored.
Oh, interesting.
Poison has been used. Now, arson is relatively common. In some cases, again, since women are seen to a much greater extent among this group of mass murderers, and when women perpetrate mass murder, they're often involved in familicide, and the victims are their children. They would commit mass murder by throwing people off of buildings and stuff like that, drowning them. So those are much less common, and again, primarily it's seen among the small subgroup of young women who have a number of children, who victimize their children and tend to be psychotic.
Okay, very interesting. So we checked out your article in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, or J4Sci, and you kind of hit on this, but I just want to read what appeared to us to be the key finding, then have you break it down further and let us know if, since you made this conclusion, if you've added on to it at all. So let me just read from your article real quick. Although public discourse often centers around the role of severe mental illness, i.e. involving positive symptoms of psychotic illness, namely hallucinations, delusions, and or thought disorganization, in mass shooting events in academic settings, our data do not support this supposition. So that seemed to be like the heart of what's a surprising finding, I think, to many people.
It's very hard for people to understand because one automatically thinks that one would have to have some sort of condition or some sort of significant brain abnormality, to perpetrate a mass murder. And so to some degree, I would agree, of course, this is not a normal thing. You have to be severely impaired in some way to perpetrate a mass shooting or a mass murder of any type. This is why I did mention and why it's so important that we understand the role of, for example, psychopathy and mental illness. So with schizophrenia or psychosis, like I said, about 4 to 5% of mass shooters are driven to a mass shooting by psychosis. And that means that they're hearing voices telling them that they have to kill people, or they're so delusional and paranoid that they're acting out of what they perceive as being self-defense. That's very uncommon. Is those numbers are decreasing over time because we know how to address violence among people with mental illness and those sorts of things. Now, from the psychopathy side of things, psychopathy is very rare among mass murderers, very common among serial killers. What that means is that, and we've learned more about this, mass murderers and mass shooters in particular are normal people. These are normal people who, for one reason or another, become radicalized in the broad sense, respond to some sort of stress in their life, or for some reason, and usually over time, as you all probably know, mass shootings are usually planned. They don't happen truly impulsively, as we understand the word impulsive to mean. So these are generally normal people who change and engage in these extremely evil acts. And that's very important as we understand, again, motivations and how to prevent mass shootings and other types of mass murder. But again, other types of mass murder, different mass shootings are different than mass murder perpetrated with other methods.
Dr. Girgis, I have 2 quick questions. For sticking with firearms, what was the number 2 country behind the United States?
Canada.
Canada
has a fair amount of mass shootings per capita. So I'd say Canada, so the U.S. number 1, very common in Canada.
Wow, I guess it does kind of surprise me,
especially considering that their population is very small compared to ours.
That's right.
1/8 maybe the size.
Also, did you take a look or study at all the Vegas shooter?
Sure. Yes, of course.
What was there? Can you give me like a little bit of a kind of a take on that?
That counts as that is a unique mass shooting. I can't speak to the individual per se, but that mass shooting, that's one of the mass shootings that we would include in the database. I think that mass shooting was different than most mass shootings. Most mass shootings involve a smaller number of people, of course. And in that case, if I'm not mistaken, that didn't involve suicide on the part of the perpetrator.
Yeah, I think the police dropped him.
The police got him?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So
I guess that one felt. I just feel free to rebut this, but I felt like that particular shooting felt very purposeful and very angry. There was really some rage behind that one.
In what sense? In what sense? You're right, but in
50
in what
caliber
sense?
gun from a window onto a concert, and what was found in his room. I'm looking. I have no inside knowledge or anything like that. Just the sense of how he went about it just gave me that feeling. And I've been one of the questions I've been kind of dying to ask you in your research on this is if there's anything to that.
Well, in general, yes. I mean, the profile, psychological or other profile of a mass shooter, and again, that mass shooting was a little different because of of course, the extremely high victim count,
right?
Of course, but there's a profile of mass shooters. Again, they tend not to be psychopaths, and for the most part, they're also not psychotic. So we have to understand the other, like, approximately 93 or 94%. So then we'll break it down a little further. I will specifically answer your question, but then we'll break it down a little further. So then we have these mass shootings, these personal cause mass shootings. About 40 to 45% of these are domestic mass shootings, familicide mass shootings. Those are very different. That's kind of one group. Very different. I mean, the main difference being private versus public. So again, 40 to 45%. Then about 30 to 35% are personal cause felonious or felony mass shootings. Those involve mass shootings involved in the conduct of some other sort of crime, not gang related, etc., but personal cause. Again, 30 to 35%. So now we're at about 80%, and then you take away the 5 or 6% involving psychosis or psychopathy. So then we get to the other about 15%. These are the public mass shootings that most people understand as mass shootings, like, for example, the Las Vegas. So what contributes to like psychologically contributes to the perpetration of a public mass shooting? So this doesn't apply to everybody, but there is a psychological kind of profile for people. And again, I can't speak to any particular person, but there are really 3 characteristics for most public mass shooters. Number 1 is so a lot of people say, gun availability, of course, but that's for everybody. So it's more a marked fascination with or affinity for firearms. So in most cases, these people don't just have access to firearms, but they have a great affinity for them or fascination with them. Number two is nihilism, a severe degree of nihilism taken to the greatest extent that leads to someone taking their own life or committing suicide by cop, as they say. That's kind of the colloquial way of saying it. And then number 3, and I think this might be what you're getting at, is a kind of toxic, primitive form of narcissism. Now, when some people think of narcissism, they think of, kind of the very arrogant, somewhat naive person who's kind of grandiose, thinks they're just very special and talented, likes looking at themselves in the mirror, and they're relatively harmless. So that's kind of maybe how someone who isn't a medical or psychiatric professional would understand narcissism. When we refer to narcissism, we refer to usually something much more primitive and different. This is where the anger comes from, which is what you described. And yes, I mean, this is a common trait of all mass shooters. So the narcissism that we often see among mass shooters manifests in this anger and this projection outward. And that's what it is. Ultimately, and people might have heard this before, and just kind of make it simple, narcissism is about feeling very badly about oneself. And we can talk about the reasons for that. But narcissists in the more toxic and primitive sense, feel very badly about themselves. They project this onto other people, and that makes them want to kind of lash out in one way or the other, or in the most limited sense, just be angry, but also lash out physically or in other ways, whether it's by perpetrating a mass shooting or whether it's, in all the other ways that toxic, primitive, insecure, narcissistic, empty people treat other people. And we all know these people in their lives. There aren't that many of them, but several percents of anyone are probably like that. And again, in the most severe and primitive situations that would lead to a mass shooting. Tied in with the narcissism is this, and this is really what differentiates public from, maybe more private mass shootings, is the great desire for fame. A paper was actually published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Medicine recently, maybe just like a year or two ago, on the importance of fame in the kind of the motivation or the pathway to a public mass shooting.
That is a really, really interesting answer. I don't think I would have looked at it that way. And I think you've touched on some of this for my next question is what effect does severe mental illness have on impulse control?
Exactly. So the more severe mental illnesses, and when we refer to severe mental illness, we're primarily speaking about psychosis, also bipolar disorder and major depression to some degree, but primarily psychotic disorders impair impulse control. That's just kind of what they do by nature. That's why we see that violence is like the perpetration of violence is ever so slightly increased among people with severe mental illness. In the case of people with psychosis, there is, again, a slight overrepresentation among people who perpetrate homicide or commit homicide or mass murders, like we said. So that is observed. The reason why the overrepresentation is not higher than a few percent, and that, by far the vast majority of people with psychotic illnesses and other sorts of severe mental illness are not violent and are certainly not mass shooters, is that this effect of impulse discontrol or impulse dysregulation in people with severe mental illness is primarily observed in women. And this is a relative thing. So one would ask, why is that the case? That's because young men who perpetrate violence most often already have problems with impulse control. So the effect of mental illness or severe mental illness in particular is not very great. However, it is very great in women. And that is why among female mass murderers, so many of them have severe mental illness, because it has such a great effect on their impulse control. That effect is minimally seen in men. That's why it helps us understand, but is also why we don't really see a great overrepresentation of severe mental illness among mass shooters.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I'm clear. How is the effect different between males and females?
It's just greater in women. It's a matter of a difference. Men, like young men, are so impulsive to begin with that right. The added effect of severe mental illness is just a little. It's not very great. Whereas younger women just are much less impulsive than men, much less likely to be violent. So the effect of mental illness then is perceived to a much greater degree. It's just a matter of quantity, and it's relative, of course. I mean, men still perpetrate many more mass shootings and right. Many more of other types of mass murder than women, but the effect is greater in women. So among women, mass murderers, many more of them are psychotic.
Well, there's that Y chromosome again, causing us problems.
It's a major problem. Major problem.
So if severe mental illness is not really a predictor for mass shootings, you kind of broke down the three characteristics that these folks might have. How do they get these characteristics? I mean, is it something about society, upbringing? This is obviously a multifactorial thing and hard to nail down, but what are some of the big contributors that cause somebody to develop these characteristics?
Yes, exactly. It's all of these things. And that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to prevent and predict mass shootings. There are different levels and layers at which we can prevent and predict these and intervene. And there are multiple levels of cause, which is what you're speaking to. Most upstream is, depending on depending on your background or perspective, it's evil or sin. Maybe if you're from a more religious background, it is major deficits in superego. If you're coming from a psychological background, it's immorality, criminal behavior from a third or fourth background. That's maybe more all the way upstream. Maybe most proximally, it would be something like availability of guns. It is the fact, and I can speak more to this if you want, but it is the fact that if we were to limit gun availability more, less of these would happen. There's so much evidence that suggests that would be the case. It's pretty much accepted by the field now. So there are different ideologies depending on how far close we are to the event and the mass shooter. We can intervene at each of these steps. Maybe in between, just gun availability and most upstream, which is evil or sin or whatever, would be things like you said, social media and the need for at least society's imposition of the need for attention among especially young people, but all people now. This has actually been going on for a long time. It's worsened, of course, with social media, but this began really to become a bigger problem around the 70s or 80s. You all may remember, and we've actually published this, mass murders of all types, including mass shootings, were prevalent at about a rate of 7 per billion people in the world from 1900 to about 1970, 1975. At that time, they've steadily gone up. This is per capita to where we are now at about 28 per billion people. So, and it was around the 70s or 80s when really media exploded. We had media before that. We obviously had certainly movies and television and those sorts of things before that. But it is around the 70s and 80s when, for example, it was only in the 80s when, for example, you could rent movies at home and began having music television and all these sorts of things. So that's one contributing factor, but that's not the only contributing factor. There has been less influence on younger people now, and especially since the 70s and 80s, from parents and teachers. Now there's a lot more influence from everyone but parents and teachers. That's probably had an effect. Substance use to some degree has had an effect. Substance use of all kind does the same thing that mental illness does. It impairs impulse control, and actually to a greater degree than mental illness, even to a greater degree than, for example, a psychotic disorder. So all substances, especially alcohol, of course, but all substances impair impulse control and associated with violence. They're not the whole problem, though. They're maybe part of it, maybe 5 or 10%, but we're basically looking at a pie, and there are slices of the pie, and there are a lot of contributing factors.
You mentioned about evil and sin being kind of like, the most upstream. I know you've done some research and writing on that. Can you tell us just a little bit about your work in that area and how that came to interest you and how it affects your practice and your research?
Sure. I'm Christian. And one of the things I wanted to examine, along with the relationship between psychosis and mass murder, or the non-relationship between psychosis and mass shootings in particular, was what the Bible really says about psychosis and what those people in the Bible who supposedly had some sort of severe mental illness or were demon possessed or whatever really had going on. And so I wrote a book about that, and it was all very interesting. So again, these people, so for example, psychotic people, the way it's understood both legally, like civilly and how the law looks at, with like not guilty by reason of insanity and those sorts of things, and religiously with, for example, traditional Christian religions and other similar religions, is that people who are very ill, like truly psychotic and might commit a murder, something like that, are not actually responsible in an ethical or legal way. Obviously, we have to make sure that those who get in, they get treatment and all those sorts of things, but they don't have the mens rea or whatever, from the legal perspective or from the religious perspective, the kind of moral understanding of what they did, or that what they did was wrong. I think that makes a lot of sense. However, again, that is not as relevant to mass shootings because so many of mass shooters don't have mental illness. It stems from evil. Ultimately, that is what the problem is. And importantly, these were normal people who then decided to engage in these extremely evil, heinous acts. It's like, I tell people, and other psychologists and psychological or psychiatric professionals who talk about evil and atrocities committed throughout the world, especially, for example, in the 20th century, say these things. A lot of what we hear, for example, Nazism and all those sorts of things, was not primarily perpetrated. The people involved in those ideologies were not primarily psychopaths. Some of them were. The people at the top, a lot of people were just psychopaths from day one. They were torturing animals and those sorts of things. But most of them, the vast majority, fell into this dangerous, evil ideology. So it's very common, and a lot of people want to think. We all want to think that we would never fall into these ideologies. We would never perpetrate these sort of things. But what history tells us and what we understand is that the vast majority of people could unfortunately very easily be turned, and that's what we see with these mass shooters. Again, whether it's because of some sort of rhetoric or propaganda, or falling in with the wrong people, and maybe combined with some early life stress, general stress in one's life, other sorts of crises, people do change and unfortunately then perpetrate some of these very evil acts. In the case of mass shootings, you then add on the pieces of a fascination with their affinity for firearms and this severe, marked desire for fame. And you realize that, how could someone who really doesn't have, or at least feel that they have much to offer, quickly become famous or notorious, like, and develop notoriety. And then we realize why mass shootings, especially public mass shootings, may be so common, especially recently.
You kind of touched on some of this earlier. What is it about the U.S. and the prevalence of the use of firearms? What can we learn from other countries that might help us get a handle on this problem?
Sure. It's a difficult issue because there's no doubt that limiting firearm availability would decrease mass shootings. There's no doubt about that. The issue is that, as I'm not necessarily an expert in this area, but we have centuries long traditions as part of our culture that firearms should be available to everyone, and we have the Second Amendment, and these things are important to the country, and so we have to, as policymakers, balance these differing and potentially opposing motivations and considerations. So our traditions and our culture and the Second Amendment, all those sorts of things, which are very important on the one hand. And then on the other hand, mass shootings and crime and safety and those sorts of things. Other countries are simply different. Firearms are simply not a part of the culture of virtually any other country. Canada, though, to some degree, Canada's a little more like America, and that's exactly why we see more mass shootings there. So it's really ingrained in our culture, and that's just kind of the dialectic that we have to figure out. And that's why it's just such a hard policy issue to solve.
Well, Doctor, the mass murder database, is that something that's at all publicly available, the data?
At this time, it's not publicly available per se, like not openly published on the website, but we work with anyone who wants to work with us. We love publishing papers with people and working with people and making our results available to people.
Yeah, it makes sense. And then
it's not publicly funded.
I gotcha. Okay. And I assume you're continually adding to the database. And how many cases do you have in there now, roughly?
About 2,300.
Wow. And what kind of future studies are you planning with this data?
We have so many. We are going to be publishing some on make, model, caliber of firearms, legality of firearms. We're going to be publishing some on not guilty by reason of insanity, childhood antecedents. We have data on mass shootings perpetrated in workplace settings. We have data on political mass shootings, like politically and religiously motivated mass shootings, and all personal cause, so not state or group sponsored. So we have a lot. There are about, for example, there are, I think, since 1900, there have been about 70 personal cause mass shootings of a political or religious nature.
I think it's like you knew my next question here. Less than a week ago, there was an assassination attempt on Donald Trump. I think it's natural to assume for a lot of people that, and we talked about this earlier, that the shooter was mentally ill and perhaps was bullied. Given the shooter is dead, how hard is it going to be to really determine his motivation and what drove him?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So again, without speaking about this particular perpetrator, we can tell you generally, we're actually pretty good at conducting these sorts of motivational or psychological, for lack of a better word, autopsies. I think that's the technical word. Those are pretty successful. Most people have a substantial kind of footprint that can be examined. We use these procedures in our own database to examine the motivations and childhood antecedents and background of these 2,300 perpetrators in our database. So that wouldn't necessarily be too hard. In most cases, that can be identified. I think in our own case, we were able to get a pretty good sense of about, 98.5% of perpetrators among the 2,300. Wow. So it's actually not that hard. One has to be a professional to do it, but it's not that hard.
I'm going to change up this question a little bit based on what we discussed before we jumped on our call here. Do you think shooters in this situation know their life will be over after the shooting, or are they getting like a gamer mentality? They give them a false sense of invincibility as if it wasn't real. And so kind of in other words, are we moving closer to a situation where consumers of VR games and video gamers view real life through the partial lens of virtual reality? Or am I just like way off the track with that?
No, you're not off track with that for sure. And actually both of your points are important and very relevant. So, and they're related. So on the one hand, in terms of not being in reality, those sorts of things, it's actually, I think what a lot of this does is, and this also goes back to why mass shootings have been increasing over the last several decades. This sort of behavior is being normalized. In general, we see this among many mass shooters. So violence is being normalized, and there are studies on this, and they demonstrate mixed results to some degree, but when you look at them together and you consider confounding and bias and those sorts of things, it's pretty clear that if you expose people to severe violence like this, they're going to adopt that, think it's normal, and pursue it. There's little doubt about that. And violence has now become glorified and romanticized in media, and this includes video games, this includes movies and television and music. And these industries, again, especially over the past 30 to 40 years, have to an even greater and greater degree romanticized violence, and not just violence, especially gun violence. And that's a problem, and it's normalized. So you combine that, and that speaks to kind of that first criterion of the psychological profile, the fascination with or affinity for firearms. That is definitely affected by media, including video games. And again, not just them. Again, the causes are multifactorial, but right. Totally agree with you. That's a very good point. Number two, about death or suicide. I always tell people, if there's one kind of aspect of a mass shooter's psychology, and not in all cases, but in most cases, that one needs to consider and be aware of, is that second point that I mentioned among the three of the psychological profile, is that the nihilism, which in its most severe form involves suicide. More than 50% of mass shooters take their own life at the event. More than 50%. And that percentage, or the prevalence of suicide among mass shooters at the time of the event, is increasing. The bottom line is that the mass shooting is in most cases and again, I can't speak to the specific shooting of a week ago, but in most cases among public mass shooters, they realize that this is the last event in their life.
To your point, and one of the reasons I asked that question is because it's been reported that the shooter left on a gaming community message board and the game featured presidential assassinations, and the increasing reports that many shooters were heavy gamers.
Yeah. Again, I do believe that. I mean, it seems like, again, without
like grooming,
a specific case, I would. Sorry, say that again.
I would say it almost appears like subconsciously we're grooming our youth.
Yeah. Well, there's little doubt about it. And again, if one were to read the literature, there are studies that say that violent video games don't encourage violence and these sorts of things, but I think that the preponderance of evidence suggests that the media are maybe unknowingly encouraging this sort of violence. It's at the least normalized, but to a greater degree encouraged. And I don't think they mean to encourage it, but gun violence in particular is romanticized in the media, in the music industry, in movies, in television, and in video games. It's romanticized, and it'd be natural for young people who engage with these sorts of media to value that sort of thing, and it's not good.
You brought up the excellent point about how there was a shift in the 70s and 80s about just availability of media. For example, we had Betamax and VHS, and you could rent videos. And I was just thinking that we've had a second revolution, I would say, in the last 5 years in streaming. In other words, we can get a lot more content a lot quicker. And of course, that content is more graphic and violent now. And I'm just wondering if anyone studied this, if there's been a peak in mass shootings, say in the last 5 years, that potentially are caused by this new wave of media.
100, yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, no, the slope or the rate of increase has been increasing. It started an increase in the 70s and 80s. It's been increasing even more since social media. Now, of course, streaming, which is kind of part of social media. There was, however, because of COVID, a market dip in 2020, 21, et cetera. They're starting to increase again, but that was obviously related to COVID. But yeah, absolutely. Again, we cannot blame any one part of our culture, society completely, but there's pretty much consensus that the rise in social media and streaming and all these sorts of things are compounding the effect.
Doctor, I've heard you mention the MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment Study in the past, and I understand that's arguably like a seminal study. Could you tell us a little bit about that, why it was important, and sort of how it might dovetail with the work that you're doing?
The MacArthur study was exactly that. It was seminal. It was conducted in the early, mid, maybe late, sometimes in the 1990s. It was a huge study of violence among people with psychiatric disorders who were admitted to psychiatric hospitals. It really kind of made clear to us what the risk of violence was among people who were more mentally ill, particularly people, again, with depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and substance use disorders. And they found exactly what we've discussed, that violence is the prevalence of violence is increased, among people with these conditions, having multiple conditions, substance use disorders, and one of the other conditions increases the risk of violence to a much greater degree, like a synergistic degree, so just not like double, but much more than double, or the combined effect. And the greatest risk is substance use. There is no doubt about that, and that's similar for that those findings hold for mass murder and mass shootings. Substances, mental illnesses, they do increase the risk. Again, not like we're not talking about 50% or 40%, but they do increase the risk, and those conditions are overrepresented among mass shooters and mass murderers of all types.
Doctor, you mentioned in another interview how emptiness plays a role in these lone wolf shootings. Could you expand on that? I thought this was really fascinating.
Sure. Emptiness is a component of nihilism and severe narcissism. What nihilism refers to feeling that there's really nothing, there's nothing in life, one has nothing going for them. There's nothing worthwhile. They're essentially nothing. That is an emptiness. Most people who aren't nihilistic feel positive about things. They have goals. They understand kind of themselves, their place in the world, what they have to offer. They want to have relationships. If you're nihilistic, you have no real desires. Nothing makes you happy. Again, you have no goals. You're not looking towards the future and those sorts of things. That's what we describe as emptiness. Yes, it's again to the greatest extent that leads to one's decision to take one's life and suicide. And again, that's seen in over 50% of mass shooters. It's the most important problem. It's probably where we can intervene more than anywhere else besides just limiting gun availability. But as, for example, mental health practitioners, that's where we can intervene more than anywhere else. And also, just to be clear, one thing, suicide, these people must be mentally ill. What we're finding, and we've actually published this recently, is that when we look outside of mass shooters, I think about 90% of people who take their own life have a psychiatric disorder, primarily depression. Not so among mass shooters. So this is a different type of nihilism. It's not coming just from depression or schizophrenia, those sorts of things. This is, again, people who don't have mental illness, who aren't psychopaths or whatever. They feel very empty. They see no future for themselves, have no goals, don't have a sense of, how they relate to people or their place in the world or society.
If I give you the magic wand, what would be the one singular thing that you could do to bring down mass shootings in the U.S.?
Well, most proximally, it would of course be to limit gun availability. I mean, that would, because what we find is that, so this is the other thing that we found with our data, and we can only understand this. We can only understand this with our data set, and because we are able to compare people who use firearms and use firearms, is a lot of people think that someone decides to perpetrate a mass shooting, and then they use, they use a gun because, for, rather than another method. And if a gun weren't available, they would just perpetrate mass murder with another weapon. That is definitively not the case. The data are clear that if the gun were not available or were not accessible, the mass murder would not happen. It's not just that people want to perpetrate a mass murder and then they find a weapon. It's they want to perpetrate a mass shooting, or they want to perpetrate another type of mass murder. It's not just either. It is either, or it's not. They specifically choose to use a firearm and perpetrate a mass murder or not. But if the firearm were not available, they would not perpetrate the mass murder. That's very clear at this point.
Well, it sounds like, unfortunately, we're on a trend line up on these types of incidents. Like you said, the social media, the streaming, and all of that. But short of dealing with the gun availability, I mean, are we just going to see this increase, or is there any reason to believe that we might have a leveling off for some other reason in society? What's your best guess?
I'm concerned, to be very frank. I'm concerned.
Yeah, it doesn't sound hopeful from what you described.
No, I'm concerned, not because we can't affect change, but because I don't think we will. There are some even easier things that we can do to curb the rise in these and curb the tide. For example, and again, this is, many experts have said this, and many people have shared this, and that is that, and this is very easy to implement. The media should not share the names, should not share pictures of perpetrators. That is feeding into the epidemic, so that it can very easily be done. The media know this. I mean, this is not a secret, but I'm not sure the media is motivated to do that. We should talk about them, and this is important for prevention, and discussions like this are very valuable. All people have to do is all the media have to do are not share names, not give any private information, no pictures, nothing like that. That takes away the fame component. Because unfortunately, everyone knows the name of John Wilkes Booth, and everyone knows the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. And even though those weren't necessarily mass shooters, you understand what I'm getting at. People also know the names of, I won't say them, but the names of the more recent mass shooters. Everyone knows these names. So we should even be able to do that, but we can't. And that's why it's concerning to me. We can affect the suicide rate using other means. We can affect this issue with, gun availability. But I'm concerned if we can't even keep ourselves from constantly, posting the pictures of these people and their names and stuff, and basically giving them the notoriety that they sought. I'm not sure what else we can do. To speak to the firearm thing in particular, I do want to mention that we can, even without severely limiting gun availability, we can also take action on, more specifically speaking, access of mass shooters to firearms. We have found that in the vast majority of cases of public mass shootings, the perpetrator used legally obtained firearms. We're talking about over 80%. And in many cases, those firearms were for whatever reason, acquired, again, legally by a close family member or friend. This is very common, especially among public mass shooters. These are the types of things that we can intervene on immediately. For example, both directly and indirectly by affecting the suicide rate. And this has been known for many years, and researchers, especially experts on suicide like John Mann, have been publishing this for many years. We could use smart gun technology. This would cut suicides and violence and mass shootings in half, like that. I mean, it would just, it would be amazing. You're familiar with smart gun technology. That just means use your fingerprint to activate firearms, so that only the person who buys and is supposed to and is legally is able to legally use or carry the firearm would be able to discharge. And I mean, there are simple things like this that could be done that aren't being done, and that's why I'm concerned.
That's a great point, because you need a fingerprint to get into your phone, but not use a gun.
Yeah, it's a very easy technology. It's actually it's very secure. It's very well advanced. It wouldn't be as much of a problem as some people say it would be.
Where can we direct our listeners who want to dive a little deeper on this topic? What are some of the good resources or books that you can recommend? Sure.
There is the Gun Violence Archive. You just type that into Google, into the internet. They have a lot of information. People can also read the reports from the Violence Project, the mass shooting project. They're great. They're very easy to understand information and report with lots of great graphics and those sorts of things. And then there is also the Northeastern University USA Today, I think also Associated Press database. So you can type these into the internet, Google, whatever, you can get a lot of great information. And of course, we primarily publish in the kind of the academic literature, and that's kind of just what we do since we're just academics. Our papers are obviously also out there. People can certainly read them. But those are probably the best resources.
Well, Dr. Girgis, we're so honored that you took so much time to speak with us today. And I think this was an important discussion, and unfortunately a very timely one. And I know our listeners are going to benefit greatly from this. So, Doctor, we hope to keep in touch with you and see what you're up to next. So thanks again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, Dion, that was a lot of information. That was really academic and fascinating. I mean, it just seems so counterintuitive that severe mental illness is really not a predictor of the propensity of someone to commit a mass shooting. But, although, as the doctor said, it's if you look at other types of killings, of course, those are more associated with severe mental illness, such as a serial killer or somebody like that. But a mass shooter is a whole different animal.
Yeah, I think it was, for me, it was the opposite of everything I thought it would be on the mass shootings. It literally was the opposite, and I was really shocked by some of his comments on there. And obviously, he's an expert, so there's no reason to doubt it. But just what you hear, kind of in the news and things like that, there's always a severe mental illness component, and he's just saying that's just not always the case.
Yeah, that's right. So let's kind of recap. Dr. Girgis talked about 3 traits that mass shooters do seem to have. And that was marked fascination with firearms. So he's talking about not a hobbyist, not just a Second Amendment kind of person, but somebody who's like obsessed with guns. The other one he listed was nihilism, which is like basically feeling that there's nothing out there for you. You don't mean anything. You might as well kill yourself. It doesn't matter. And then narcissism. And I like how he defined it. It was more about not that you feel so great about yourself, but that you feel terrible about yourself, and that you project that onto other people. And so then the question, of course, is, well, how do people come up with these 3 traits? But I thought they were an interesting illustration of what goes wrong with somebody who isn't mentally ill per se, but they're still going to have some kind of obvious personality deficit or problem. And these 3 seem to kind of encapsulate it. I mean, what did you think about that, Dion?
Well, one is the narcissism really surprised me. I think that just caught me by surprise. And those are also, those 3 that you listed are not things I would actually all put together.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. I just wouldn't, if someone said, hey, what do you think it is? Now, I obviously, kind of goes without saying the firearms, but the other 2 really caught me by surprise, and the way that he described it, but all of it makes sense when he laid it out for us,
Yeah. And then the question is, well, how do you get to that? How do you get to nihilism or narcissism?
How do you spot it? How do you spot it?
How do you
try to head it
right,
off?
right. What are the red flags to stop it? But obviously, desire for fame goes hand in hand with narcissism, and that's at all-time high now. Because I don't know, Dion, we're old, but it seems like you used to have like a talent or something that would make you famous, and now that's not so much the case.
It's an ugly way to do a shortcut.
Like and one way, unfortunately, is to get notoriety. But then the other thing that can mess you up, short of mental illness, but help hurt your impulse control, is substance abuse. And I just wonder, we've got gnarlier drugs now, I would say, than maybe we had in the 70s. It's not just so, I mean, you just think of insidious things like fentanyl or bath salts, and
so potent. These things are so potent,
so
and they
strong.
take control of
people are getting
so quickly,
so messed up that it seems to me, not being an expert, that has even greater effect on your impulse control than some of the classic drugs. So a couple other things he hit were parental influence and school influence. And I tell you, my wife is a middle school teacher, and the lack of respect that kids, and I sound like an old man, and that's fine because I am, but it's just unbelievable, like some of the things her kids will say to her, the lack of respect for their teachers, and the same thing's going on at home. So I mean, this is a societal,
well, I'm going to join you in the old thing,
problem a little bit too.
Yeah, I'll join you in the old guy comment. Is that there's just an overall breakdown in society,
right? That's what I'm saying.
Guardrails, and it's scary. And if you don't, I hate to use the dog, but if you don't train a dog early, he's going to eat your furniture, and that's just kind of what we're seeing now. Is just this really young, aggressive kids, and then you get to substance abuse and maybe some mental miscues, and there you have all the ingredients there for a mass shooter.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what can we do about it? Well, changing society is tough, but one of the quick
starts in the home, just like the doctor mentioned.
Starts at home, and then also, like the doctor said, trying not to make these people as famous. So if the people in the media, I mean, it's hard because you sort of have to report the news, but you don't have to repeat it. You don't have to go into a deep dive on the air. You don't have to keep mentioning the person's name or showing their picture. All of that will mitigate things. But is media going to come around to that? I don't know.
I see that in really small steps right now. I see various news organizations not printing the name or giving them, especially after this last one with the former president. I definitely see that. They're seems like they're really going out of their way not to give him any more headlines. So hopefully that has an impact on the next person that comes along that's thinking about doing that.
But here's the bad news. Mainstream media is being taken over by social media. I mean, I remember when I watched the Trump assassination thing, you could go on Twitter, you would have all the info before it was on the news. And so there's no guardrails there for somebody.
Yeah, that's
a
great point. You
hey,
could get his height, weight, his favorite food, and everything within seconds of it happening. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, not to be a downer here, but
thanks, man.
Yeah, exactly. But it's just fascinating that we just want to throw the mental health label on people, and it just sounds like by and large that mass shooters are kind of regular people who've snapped. And you have to remember that this is typically pre-planned. It just didn't sort of just happen. They're responding to some kind of stress. They somehow got radicalized. And like we said, they're looking for fame. So it's a complex problem. So certainly we don't want to politicize it one way or the other. We need some real experts looking into this and looking at the causes rather than just pointing fingers and casting blame, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the more that we're finding out on this latest one is that, there was a lot of pre-planning. I mean, he was at the range, using his long gun, the whole 9 yards.
Right. He didn't just have a sudden mental episode.
I'm going to go climb up on this roof and try to shoot somebody. One of the questions, Mehul, that I brought up to Dr. Girgis was what role, virtual reality and some of these games are.
Right.
And I'm not going to dump it all on the gaming industry. Everything for me comes down to personal responsibility. I've actually been a stunt performer in some of these games before, but the games that I performed in and the games that are out now with the goggles and the virtual reality
night and day
are night and day. And my part of my questioning to the doctor was, is this kind of serving as a boot camp for these killings? In other words, are you able to technically work? Yeah, exactly. That's it. That's where is a how to perform these. And that's the part that I don't even know how you'd begin to regulate it, especially if the person's over 18. But I'm how these games are so real and they're so technically precise, because if you actually look at some of the people that are involved with these games, you're seeing paid experts from the Five Eye agencies that are giving expertise to make them more real.
Yeah, good point.
So I don't even know how you would stem this, but this is something where, like I said, I'll go back to my point is that I think it's serving as almost like a virtual boot camp for this stuff.
Yeah, and then I was thinking too about what is the effect on music on society, and we've been talking about this since the '80s with PMRC and actually body count and Ice-T and all of that. But part of it, I was thinking when we had the Ice-T episode, we were talking about with Douglas Century about the book he wrote and how there's certain themes and images, say in Ice-T's music, but the problem is that the listeners don't get the point. He's actually not glamorizing being a drug dealer. He's saying this is what the downfall is going to be. This is what the end of the story is. But people aren't listening to that. They're not hearing about the bad part of it. They're just hearing about the good part of it. So there has to be a little bit in all aspects of life. We just all lack critical thinking. That needs to be taught, number one. So what do you think about this idea that Dr. Girgis said about smart guns as a precaution? I mean, I really like that. Smart technology and guns.
I know there's probably a dozen reasons that I can't think of right now of why this hasn't been done. Maybe it's some kind of infringement on the Second Amendment or something like that. But I think this is actually a brilliant idea. I think it stops a lot just right off the bat. It's like, same thing, if you had a car that, for theft, if it was a thumbprint or something like that, then no one else could start your car or whatever. But I think it's a great idea. Yeah,
it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I could see one argument being, hey, listen, there's an intruder in my home and I go to pick up my gun, and you know how technology, you also have problems with it, and you can't afford to have that. I can't be struggling with the fingerprint reader, but come on, there's a workaround. We have this problem with technology. Overall, this solves a problem because, like Dr. Girgis was saying, it's not necessarily an illegally got gun that's used. It's perhaps the son used the father's gun who wasn't supposed to have access to it. Right. And of course, if that was biometrically locked, we wouldn't have this problem.
Yeah, and there's actually been more of those. So it that's all you need. If you stop one, it helps, right?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, Dion, this was a little bit of a troubling episode, but I think it was necessary and it was a good discussion because, we need to understand what's really going on here and not just what the media says or what most people think. And it's not that we can't get to a better place, like the doctor said, but will we rise up as a society and know that we are going to have to make some sacrifices in order to get this benefit?
Well, let me give the doctor some more real quick props on that. Is that we need more guys like that, more men and women with his expertise.
We'll speak up
and get this information. Information is key to solving a lot of this. And so, anybody out there listening, get Dr. Girgis on your show and let him tell a story and give you the real facts of this research.
Yeah, I agree. Please. I mean, we always want you to spread our episodes, but particularly this one, I think it just helps in the consciousness of the community to learn some of this. Well, thank you very much, listeners and social media followers. This is an important topic, and we want to hear your comments on today's interview. So, join in on the conversation. Instagram, on X, on LinkedIn, Facebook, and even TikTok. Be well, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.